Hey everyone, it's Ben from Songwriters on Process, and today I have my super fun interview with Dave Hause and Kathleen Edwards. Now, this is my second time interviewing Dave. The first one was in 2010, and a lot has changed since then. Back then, Dave was based in Philadelphia. Now he lives in California. And back then, he had no kids, and now he has two 20-month-old kids. And as you can imagine, having twins affects his creative process. Sure, he has less time, and as he said, I think he spends a lot of his days chasing two kids going in opposite directions, both looking for trouble. But also, that affords him time to go to the park, walk around, go take the kids walking, and that walking really benefits his writing process. But also the discipline that it takes. And I have four kids, and I know what that's like. But the discipline that it takes when you have less time in your day because of other commitments, it often makes you more disciplined and a better writer because you know you have less time to write and less time to mess around. Um, 10 years ago, I also asked him, we both shared our guilt at the stacks of magazines that pile up at our bedside, and they come in every week, and we don't get to them, we don't read them as much as we'd like, and the stacks pile up, and it gets bigger and bigger. And so I asked him now, 10 years later, has the stack got any smaller? What are your reading habits like? Who are you reading? And Kathleen, you may know her backstory. Kathleen lives in Canada. She's Canadian. And in 2014, she quit the music industry. Although I really shouldn't say she quit. I think she took a hiatus and opened up a coffee shop called Quitters. So her latest album, released in August, Total Freedom, is her first album since then, and it is tremendous. I love it. I've been listening to it a lot. It is great, and we talked about what it's like to write again. She didn't really quit writing, but what it's like to get into that album process again, and also again how having less time makes her a more productive writer. Talked, of course, about the dogs, how the dogs affect her writing process. We talked about co-writing with Maren Morris. She's not a big co-writer, and we addressed that as well. And we talked about what she does when she gets into a rut, what she does when she gets writer's, I won't say block, but when things aren't coming as quickly as she'd like, when she likes to write, what she likes to write with, and in general, how often she likes to write. So it was a great interview. I loved it. A lot of banter between the two of them. They know each other, so it was fun to hear them go back and forth and ask each other questions. The website is songwritersonprocess.com. Check it out. There are close to 200 interviews with songwriters strictly about the writing process. One more thing, my audio gets a little out of sync towards the end. I apologize for that, but I can't really fix it because this was on Zoom. But there's a little bit of wackiness with my audio. So, hope you enjoy it. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, check out the website, and thanks for watching.
All right, so let's start with this then. Um, do you find, especially since we've been, quarantined for so many months, I guess in general, do you find that large expanses of time, and Kathleen, we'll start with you, then Dave, do you find that large expanses of time are productive? I mean, I think people can go both ways. You have a lot of time, and then you kind of, piss that time away, or do you find that large expanses of time give you a lot of time to create? Because I think some people can say have a hard time with that, and they maybe need firm deadlines. But how productive are you in times like that, Kathleen?
I'm so unproductive. I use that time to do everything that isn't focusing with any discipline on writing. Yeah. I'm better with deadlines and I'm better with pressure to actually get into a rhythm of being disciplined. And then I'm very productive. But on a day like today, like COVID, I went and gardened. I purged my house. I moved. I did everything except create. Although, to be fair, I had just finished writing an album and I was very good at saying to myself, you just made a record. It took 3 years to do in bits and pieces and fits and starts. You don't have to beat yourself up for not being productive during this time that most artists and creators would fantasize about. You don't have to feel guilty for not being productive.
Yeah. Do you find that, because I'm the kind of the same way, I do work well with deadlines when I'm writing things, and I will create a false deadline. And a false deadline to me isn't, oh, I'll start the stopwatch and write for an hour. It's, oh, if I have a phone call in a couple hours, I'll start writing because I know that I have to stop. That's a hard stop. So do you do you create false deadlines to kind of make yourself more productive in those cases?
For me, a show is usually a really great sort of deadline, and worst case scenario, the show won't be canceled because I didn't go with a new song. So I typically did use getting myself back into writing. I did actually use a deadline, but it was something that I didn't necessarily have to hold myself to, but I knew that feeling. I could sort of like project myself into the future and say, how good is it going to feel when you show up and play a few new songs at that show, rather than just do the songs you've been playing for all these years without new material. And that was enough to motivate me to so those deadlines do really help.
Yeah, even on like a day-to-day basis. I mean, on a day when we don't have shows, does it those deadlines then or is there a way to set those, I guess, on when you're not on the road?
Yeah, I think I'm very good at using something like a visualizing myself doing it once it's already done. And that for some reason helps motivate me to stay on task a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is typically the thing.
Yeah. Dave, how about you?
Well, I mean, I'd have to sort of go back to pre-babies and pre-COVID to give you like any answer that has, like wherein there was a pattern. Like both of those things have kind of blown everything out of the water. Like all of this time in quarantine is not time for me. It's just been chasing 17, 18, 19-month kids who are running in two different directions towards danger. That's most of the day. And so I have kind of their nap, which is now, to carve out for creative stuff. And then my wife and I sort of have our, she's a therapist, so she's working like crazy. So we've, it's job security for sure. But
thinking more COVID, everyone's so friggin' stressed out. She's like doubled her client intake. Everyone's like,
true. But the sad part for her is she's, at different points, she's just like, man, I hope something else happens. Because all we're talking about is the anxiety of, the American political system or mostly COVID. So, but yeah, those deadlines are helpful for me too. I mean, it's hard because there is that weird old adage of like, as a songwriter, all you need is like 10 good days a year. If you get 10 good days where you finish 10 songs, you have an album. And so that's very tempting to sort of default to when you're fucking off, which is, kind of half the reason you get into this racket is because you end up with lots of free time. I don't really have it anymore, but the deadlines definitely help me too. But it's weird. In COVID, I've sort of punted writing my next record a little bit. I keep moving that goalpost back because I just feel like we got to wait and see what we're in for, we got to know where this thing's going a little more. And at least if I'm starting writing now, you know what I mean? Like if I had a bunch of songs written, I would definitely want to put them out. But right now I'm kind of like, I don't know. I'll just chase the twins and sort of worry about it when I have a better roadmap of what life is going to look like.
On a writing thing, I just want to add to that because when you mentioned having kids, I started this coffee shop when I quit music, and within the first 6 months, maybe even the first week of running this business and being in a startup mode and having to use a totally different side of my brain that had really not ever been used, since I was a server before music became my thing. I would spend the few minutes of my free time contemplating what the hell did I do with all that time I used to have, because I am so productive. I get so much done. And I kicked myself for all of the years in which I kind of pissed away a lot of time. And yet so I would like, as just if someone ever came to me and said, I need help figuring out how to actually make myself write or carve out time or time management, my answer is this: go do something that totally threatens your ability to write and takes all your time away and removes it, and you'll realize
Yep.
that you have to make time for it in a much more kind of intentional way. And that has been an excellent exercise. And so I would always recommend, if someone's like, well, just can't get started, I have writer's block, I blah, blah, go do something else and make sure it consumes all your time.
It's so true. When I was a contractor, I got almost as many songs written as I did when I didn't have to work swinging a hammer anymore. And I think it was that same thing. It was like the repetitive motion of whether it was painting or whatever we were into, to turn a buck. Then you can go, your subconscious can kind of take over when you're like doing something that doesn't allow you to focus, and you end up with all these extra lyric ideas and melodies and so on. I'm totally with you on that. I was more productive when I had less time.
Because I've heard a lot from songwriters recently about the role of repetitive motion in their songwriting process. So Mark Morton from Lamb of God, gardens and the gardening, the repetitive motion of the gardening. I've heard from two recently, Sadler Vaden, who's Jason Isbell's guitarist, Sadie Dupuis, both talked about the role of swimming. Just swimming, the repetitive motion of swimming. I interviewed people who say they get songs on hiking, the repetitive motion of the walking. And William Wordsworth, the poet, they said he walked 100,000 miles in his life, and he would walk 30 miles a day often, and he would create all of his poems on his walks and would not come back home until he'd actually revise them in his mind. So I've heard other people talk about gardening and running and walking, so I'd like to explore that. So yeah, what do you think, Dave? We'll start with you, but what do you think, what is it about that repetitive motion? Because I hear that so often that is conducive to that.
Well, for songwriting, I mean, you're usually walking at a specific pace, so maybe it sort of sets some kind of beats per minute thing. I don't really know. I do think that anything where you can look away, it's usually like the song's usually like over here, right? And the more you focus on it, the more you can kind of mess it up. I think you can scrutinize it too much, or your internal editors can be very, vicious. So if you turn a little bit and you're focused over here, some of that just like works itself out,
Yeah.
at least in terms of the initial inspiration, and then the editing is later. It's just my editor shows up so early that's what kind of derails me. So if I can sort of let things flower a little bit by doing other stuff, like for me, it's been walking my kids, putting them in a stroller and just doing laps, you can sort of turn on. The tricky thing now is we've got podcasts, so I have to like temper how much of that I'm willing to listen to, because that'll take, all your attention.
Now, when you say your editor derails you, what do you mean by that? What is that? That sounds like it's not a good thing. Obviously, you say the word derails, but what happens there, and why is that frustrating?
Well, maybe I should be more specific. It's maybe not the editor, and it's more the critic.
Okay.
That we've all got that little demon that shows up and is like, man, this is terrible. Why would you even think that's, a good melody? Or that's not it. What are you, crazy? No one's going to sing along to this, etc. Which is never your friend. You want to have more of, I think if you get that spark of inspiration and then you do the diligence on it, you let the editor person come in later. That is like yourself, and just reassess. Usually the next morning, if you take a look, you can make quick edits, or a couple days later or whatever, you can come back and go like, oh, okay, I see that we can unlock this second verse by just doing this, that, and the other thing. Whereas if you try to do that too early, you can usually end up with just a messy soup.
Yeah. So Kathleen, I guess, do you think without role of motion, does that happen to you? Do you think and if it does, is it a beats per minute kind of thing? Because I've heard songwriters say that the songs that they write end up sometimes matching the cadence of the walk they were on. Or do you think it's just that the repetitive motion means your brain can tune out entirely from that activity and focus on the songwriting?
Uh, when you go to I know because I've gone a lot to a therapist's office, they have sensory distractions, and it says that if for example, people have the stress ball thing that they squeeze or whatever. Part of that whole, this other motor skill being active somehow kind of diminishes or makes it more fluid for you to access certain parts of your brain. And maybe that's
Mm.
like conversation, creative. I'm not a therapist except on television, but I know that for me, walking, like, so I have my two dogs. I probably walk 10K a day. Sorry, that's in kilometers. It's like 6.8 miles, but I probably walk, between 5 and 10 miles a day. I love walking. That's when I'm not working at the shop or whatever, but and I do find that all of my really good ideas that are kind of crazy clear, uncluttered, immediately hones in on the exact thing comes when I'm walking my dogs. It's not necessarily things like, oh, the lyric for that is this, and I'm walking my dog. It's things like, oh, that's the sequence, or oh, that's the title of the record, or oh, I should make a photo like this. It's sort of all these other sort of sub creative things. But I think there's something really wonderful about doing an active motion. I think like what you're saying, where you're engaged in something that's kind of repetitive, and it suddenly gives space and time to a certain side of your brain that for the most part is not as easily accessible. And when you're distracted by it, it just kind of shows up a lot more fluidly.
Yeah. Yeah, I've just heard that so often, not just with songwriters, but writers. And I've interviewed writers, novelists, who talk about the same thing, but they will actually use it. And I'm curious, I mean, when you're stuck, do you actually find yourself, hey, maybe if I go for a walk, it'll help me?
Yeah, I mean, every time I'm in a bad mood or I'm frustrated about something, whether it's specific to writing or anything else, a walk absolutely clears my mind. It clears my head. I come back in a much better frame of mind. And there's also lots of people who've written books about sort of and I live in an area I live in the Gatineau Park. So it's an area that's heavily forested. And there's a lot of science behind the idea that being out in nature, especially around trees, that trees emit certain chemicals and cause certain hormonal changes within you that actually allow you to access more serotonin and to blah, 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 blah. And so,
So, Dave, do you think it's important to write every day? And I've heard varying answers on this. Do you think it's important, whether it's journal writing, songwriting, I guess, do you write every day? Do you think it's important to write every day?
I don't. It's one of those like shoulds that I beat myself up over. I've become pretty good friends with Brian Koppelman, who's like a big write every day morning pages, disciple, and he's, the proof's in the pudding. He writes a successful show and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't. I should. It is important. Yeah. I mean, you can sort of get away with not, I think, but I don't know that you'll be as good. I mean, anything where you're practicing and like causing those grooves in your psyche or whatever to sort of those neurons that are firing, the more you get them firing, the better they do. So I find like it takes a couple weeks of like when I'm intensively writing to kind of get all the muscles back and feel like, oh, I can grab the word I'm looking for, or easily move phrases around or whatever. But yeah, it's important. I don't know. I mean, if you read as many things as I read about songwriting, like you sort of see how many of our heroes, like for as many Leonard Cohen interviews as there are where he's like, I'm a monk in my devotion to writing. There's Neil Young and Bob Dylan who are like,
I sang live off the floor and it landed.
Yeah, right. Or Paul Westerberg, or there's so many of those people who come up with these amazing songs, some of the most genius songwriting that I've scene, and it's like, oh, I came up with that 5 seconds before I had to, lay down the vocal. So I don't know. I mean, that's the weird thing about rock and roll, is you can sort of get away with a lot, I think.
Kathleen, do you write? Do you think is that important to write every day or in some fashion?
No, not at all. No.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say that the part where I took a significant, working sabbatical, I never thought I would write another song again after I, stopped playing music back in 2013. Partly because I felt like writing was just hitting my head against the wall all the time. I was like setting myself up to have to access all the painful shit that I actually just didn't want to really have a close relationship with anymore. And so when I took this hard break, I was actually able to write for my new record I was so uninhibited because I hadn't been doing it. I was able to shoot from the hip all the time, and things that were more reminiscent of me making my first record, maybe now that I can see it in hindsight, is there because I wasn't contextualizing my work. I wasn't going, that sounds a lot like the last song for my last record. I should probably like take a break from this and try and something else. I didn't have any of those monkeys on my back, and my writing was, I think, much better for it. Maybe that's also just because it's the nature of my work and the way I do things. But no, I don't write a diary. I don't write before I actually sing. I sing my words to my song as I'm writing them. So I'm making stuff up immediately as I go. And I find that's usually what sticks for me. I'll be saying, the horse is black, the horse is black. And I'll just be saying that there. And I feel fat. And I'm like, oh, that's fucking funny. And I write that down and I'm like, okay, there it is. And then I edit later if I like something or I don't. And, but that's how things land for me. I want it to feel like it's right there. And it's sometimes it just shows up and you're like, holy shit, who are you? Like, why did that come up to your brain? And that's the stuff that I find the most sort of magical about writing. It's like, where did that come from? It works.
Yeah, it really works on the new record. Like I'm so curious about how you approach that, because I mean, like, how much pressure did you put on yourself knowing you were coming back? Or did it sort of just, you ended up with a batch of songs and then we're like, oh, I can just put this record out? Like, how did you interface with that kind of time that it elapsed?
I think just having this other thing in my life, having a business and having an entire community hub that I built and having, I would compare it to having kids, where it totally diminished all of the urgency that I felt about my needs and myself. And so my business was 24/7, and it basically threw my life into a totally new state of chaos, good chaos. But, and so I think that just rebuilt my whole sense of self. And I just really started writing going, I don't give a fuck who likes this. And that's who I was on my first record. I didn't have expectations of anything happening with it. And I didn't have the same, I kind of cleaned house and I was like, I've got a blank slate in front of me. I'm just going to stick with what my gut's telling me feels good. And before, when you want to do good work and you really care about it and you're in the company of people like John Prine and you look up to people like Mary Gaucher and you care about the craft of songwriting, sometimes that can actually also be to your detriment because you're overthinking things, or you're not letting the sort of your own personality come through anymore because you're so committed to the storytelling and the narrative and doing justice to that and not worrying, you put yourself away. And that's where my songs started to get less and less sort of special, I think.
Here's another question I had for you. Sorry, Ben.
No, I love it. This is great.
Like, how did you approach production? Like, were you, because that's the other thing about this record that's so cool, is it sounds like the first couple records just updated, you know, in terms of like the choices that you made with the guitars and all that? Like, how much of that did you preconceive before you went in and cut?
You know how there are bands that you hear about who go into the studio and they've booked a month and then they don't leave, they go in
Yeah.
there until it's done, they're in there. I am like, I couldn't be farther from that. I am a stop, go, stop, go, stop, go person. I need to listen back. I then rewrite the song 3 times, not lyrically, but in pocket or an arrangement. When I
Yeah.
hear it back, I'm like, oh, that's not at all how I felt or envisioned it. And until I hear it back, I know it's landed or I don't. But the one thing that I was really committed to was working with this drummer, Peter Von Alten, who's here in Ottawa, and he played on Failure. He played on my first record, and he was like this musical guy that he had the pocket of all pockets. And then of course he had a young family, so he wasn't going to tour, he didn't record, and he's always someone I've looked up to, but he wasn't really available to work with me. And
Right.
then of course our stars aligned, and I was like, dude, I want to make this record, but I want you to be the guy that I write these songs with. So I'll bring you the song, and until it feels good with you and me, the song isn't done. Like, we're not gonna. And so we tried stuff out. Some stuff didn't end up lasting, and some stuff we went back to the drawing board a few times, and his input had a huge impact on the feel of the songs. And so he was the root of the production of the record. But you know, like, I always forget. I'm sure many people know this. I bet anyone who's written a book, an article, a song, anything, you think it's going to be one way, or you're sort of inundated with these magical fantasy stories of like, we were in the studio and it was so magical. The studio it's so frustrating because you just want to get to the end and you're like, really, we're going to do this guitar part again where he goes plink, plink, plink.
Yeah.
We're like, what are we making? And sometimes then you like literally go back and go, delete it. Like, you know,
I know.
Metallica's dad, like, delete that. And, and then, you know, other times you go, holy cow, is that really one take? Like, wow, it's so exasperating working on your project. I'm sure people writing anything, that's okay. It's supposed, like, sometimes things come easy and sometimes things come hard. There's no, well, then you probably shouldn't have continued working on the idea. You just don't know. Totally.
So this is a great segue into a quote I have written down because I interviewed the author a couple of years ago, Anthony Doerr. He won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel All the Light We Cannot See. Came out like, I think 3 or 4 years ago. I don't know if, have you read it, Dave, or have you? Yeah.
I started it. My wife read it. I started it and haven't finished it.
All right. Well, it's a great book. And I asked him if he believes in writer's block. We talked about writer's block, and he said something I'll never forget. He said he doesn't believe in writer's block. He thinks writer's block is a failure of courage. That writer's block doesn't exist. And I'm curious what both of you think about that.
Oh, it's a tough one. I think it's so hard to compare writing either short stories, novels, because and songwriting in terms of writer's block. I've a few times over COVID been asked to write a small piece for, you know, a newspaper or this and that, just my experience or my thoughts about being, you know, whatever. Everyone, you know, we asked 10 people to blah blah. And I sat down, I was like, I'd love to. Oh my gosh, what a fun project. And then I sat down to write and I was like, I am not made for this. This is not my wheelhouse. And part of it was that I didn't know where to start. And because I have this with songs, I have a new song on my record called Simple Math. And Simple Math, I had this line for, I would say, 6 or 7 years, sitting in my little brain vault of love is simple math. And I came up with that idea when I was in this really frustrating brief relationship, and I was just like, I just kind of wanted to get out, and I was like, why is this so hard and blah blah. And I wrote this thing like love should be like simple math. And I just didn't have any place to put it. I tried a few times, it just never landed, and so I put it away. And then something happened where I ran into an old friend, an old childhood friend, and we had this lovely afternoon together where we laughed and reconnected and picked up where we left off. And suddenly I went home and that idea had exactly the context that made it work, and it just bleh. The song was written within a day or two. And I think writers, like, I think not knowing where to start is sometimes not the issue. It's that you don't necessarily know what your end game is. And that's, if you're sitting down to write a novel or you're writing down to write something of substance, I don't think that's writer's block. I think that's like, I don't actually know where my end game is. I don't know. It's like that great scene from The Wonder Boys where Michael Douglas has been working on his book for 10 years and he's got this manuscript and it's piling up and it's piling up and it's piling up because he's not actually sure what the story is anymore. And that's what I always do is I just take those little pieces and I don't know what they're for. And I just go, okay, I love that, but I'm not going to force it to be something.
Yeah. So Kathleen, do you have, go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I've sent that song to all three of my sisters who I haven't seen, my best buddies, that like everybody in Philly, because I moved to California in 2013. Oh. And the sort of like agreement is, well, I get to see everyone. Like the agreement I've made with myself, not living in Philadelphia anymore and being away from my family, is like, well, I tour. So I'll see everyone 4 or 5 times a year when I go through the East Coast. And so this is the longest I've gone, but that song I've sent to everybody. Like, this is like how I feel about it. You know, it's like such a beautiful, beautiful song.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
So Kathleen, I was going to ask you, and then Dave, I want to hear what you have to say about this, but do you have a lot of those, and I hear this a lot from songwriters, a lot of those lines that are, you know, are going around in your head that don't have a home yet, and you're just waiting for them. You said that one, I think you said 6 or 7 years. So do you have a lot of lines, even maybe melodies like that are just, they need a home, but you don't know where to put them yet?
I have some pretty funny collection of words or phrases in my like notes section in my phone when I've had a few drinks and I'm like, oh, that's hilarious. And I'll put it in there, you know, like, and sometimes I look at them and I'm like, oh, that's fucking great. So I'm like, whoa, you know, but yeah, for sure. I think that's good. I think it's always good to have little things. And I think it's good just to not feel like you're obliged to put them somewhere until, you know, maybe never. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. Dave, how about you?
Hundreds and hundreds.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Of those little like 3-word or 6-word or, you know, and then there's like another file full of write a song about, which never really works. You know, you're like, write a song trying to connect these, like those are rare that they ever pan out. But yeah, there's tons of those like little orphaned ideas that sometimes do land later. It can be years.
So do you go back to them? I'm curious. Like, is it, you know, I need a line, or when, like, what point do you go back and kind of leaf through those words or phrases?
When you're stuck.
Yeah.
Like, or when it's like time, you know, the weird thing is like, I'm still working in record cycles. I mean, maybe not now with COVID, but so it's like when it's time to really stare down the barrel of like, well, I have to keep working. Right. And you know, there's sometimes kernels that are useful. A lot of times, like my brother, since I started writing with my brother, he's great in being able to like, he's like, get that shit out of here. You know, like, what about this old idea? He's like, we've seen that and there's nothing to do with, like, come on, let's do something new, you know? So I think that's been helpful, but yeah, I have a bunch of those.
Yeah. I actually had this funny story where I quit music and I got asked by this woman, Maren Morris, to go down to Nashville and write with her. And Maren is essentially a pop star now. She's had huge commercial success. And I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? Like, I'll go down. And so what I did was I went into my room that I never entered with my guitars and some journals and, you know, the things I used to use all the time to write and record, etc. And I just went through the last 2 journals that I had used. And they were all from 2012 when I put out Voyager, and I had worked out ideas about like everything, and it was in there. And then there were these few songs and pieces of songs that I had written after Justin Vernon and I broke up, and I had obviously written and worked on stuff, because it's the nature of us creators. We typically, I was still thinking about writing and recording, and I was still trying to keep momentum going. And these songs, in the end, I just couldn't see myself playing them because they were just rooted in something I just was so fucking done with. Like, I was so hurt, and I really just thought, if I make these part of my catalog, I'll never fucking escape this feeling that I have, which is I have to stay in it, and I don't want to stay in it. So, journal closes and it's gone. Well, I will open them up, and I read through some of these songs, whether they were just like a chorus idea or like an entire verse or something, and I was floored. I was really shocked that they were so thoughtful and beautiful. And so sorry, I know that sounds very self-congratulatory, but I was shocked that I actually, because I was seeing them with clean eyes again. Like, I was seeing them for what it was from a very far distance now. And I took them, and one of the ideas ended up being Good Woman with Maren Morris, that she recorded for her record. And it was, I'll sway like a tree when you need a change. We'll travel the world. We'll stay in one place. I'll hold your hand when the storm's at the door, because you've got my back and I've got yours. And she read that, and she was like, and I was like, I think it's really good. And she made it this love song about her life now. And she added stuff that worked for her, and Ian, this other guy, produced stuff too. But it's really interesting how, I'm not a co-writer at all, but it was interesting how something that I really was ready to just put in that journal and close became something that got to live in a whole other context with somebody else. And I'm not going to probably be much of a co-writer ever in my life, but it's a fun exercise to see, keep your journals, and those nuggets are always things that they end up surprising you sometimes.
Why won't you go be like, why do you have that sort of door closed in terms of co-writing?
I don't know. I mean, I think Dan Wilson is a musician, writer. He was in Semisonic.
Yeah. Dan's on my site. I interviewed him a couple years ago. Yeah, cool.
Really, really lovely man. And we toured together briefly, I don't know, 29, after he'd written all the Dixie Chicks Shut Up and Sing record. And he'd obviously been building a co-write, career of his own in LA and stuff for years. And I thought, well, maybe, a solution to not wanting to tour as much or being really burned out would be go into this co-write world. And,
right.
And I wrote him, and he wrote back and said, Kathleen, the best advice I can give you is that you will always be the best person to present your songs in your own authentic voice. And I found that to be such a incredibly wise and useful piece of advice, because it was true. I was sort of written some songs and I'd send them out and I wouldn't hear anything. And then I realized, because I'm not the kind of writer that my stuff is, I really am the best presenter of my work, for good or for bad.
Yeah.
I don't that's just the nature of the writer I am, and that's okay. And it just sort of put me totally at ease with the idea that co-writing may or may not come around, but I'm not going to put energy into it. If it comes my way, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't.
Like the Maren Morris thing. So that was sort of like, you were like, well, I'll give it a whirl. I'm not putting a lot of eggs in this basket, and it actually worked.
Yeah, I mean, I put my best foot forward, and I really cared about the experience. I really enjoyed it. But, it was one of those things. I didn't show up going, fuck, I hope I'm good, because, she's going to need songs. It's like, she's got everyone in the fucking world happy to write songs with her. So,
yeah.
there wasn't pressure that way. I just thought, well, I have these ideas, and I was happy to throw anything at the table just to try stuff. But it's not I'm more invested in doing my work.
Right.
And, I'm the one there's so many co-writers out there who are writers who are brilliant and great and create content for people, and they become huge hits. I'm the performer. So I'm more interested in being invested in that work because I don't write a ton. I'm very limited in the amount I do, in the amount I do create, and I care a lot about it, and I'd rather save it for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's weird that Dan has that. He was able to know that about you, and then knows for himself, perhaps the opposite's true, where he can write a song that, Adele sing. I mean, I guess Adele could sing the phone book and it would be tremendous, but he knows enough about that to be able to decipher that it's different for him, that his best course of action is to write for someone else. That's kind of a wild thing to be able to know.
A couple more questions. The writing ritual. I'm fascinated by this. I read the interviews with writers in the Paris Review, and they talk about their ideal environment. So interesting, the idea of ritual. So I guess Dave, and we'll start with you. And I know, obviously having kids changes kind of what your ideal writing session would be, but do you have is there an ideal time of day, a place, things you need to have with you? Because for me, at least, it's a level of confidence. I know that if I'm in a certain place in the house, if I have something with me, that confidence, for whatever reason, part of that is the confidence I'm going to get something done. But how important are those things to you, that kind of environment? And then the second part to that, and I could write an entire blog about this alone, is songwriters are viciously protective of the types of, if they do write with a pen, the type of pen that they use and the type of ink and the brand. I'm fascinated by this. So anyway, go ahead. So the writing ritual for you.
Well, I'm here to disappoint you. I don't mess around with pens. I mean, it's like,
no, really? Okay.
No. I mean, I'll typically, if I get something done and it's like, oh, this is pretty, this is what I want it to be, and this is going to make the record, I'll write that out. But it's not like the Bruce Springsteen crossed out, Maria's in there, it's not all that.
Right.
But
okay.
No, I don't really have that ideal of a setting either. Like for me, it keeps changing, it keeps moving. If I had that all the time and be able to churn out, hundreds and hundreds, but it kind of moves. And I do think it's two. I'm talking about two different things. One is like getting those bolts. Those come whether it's hiking or like fixing the car or whatever. Those are so random and those are what you really need. In terms of like the actual work, it's usually like get up, have coffee, get to work, and hammer it out. That's kind of, but that's a lot of the nuts and bolts. The actual inspiration is all over the map. It comes from all kinds of stuff. So
yeah. Kathleen, how about you? Do you have a ritual to the writing process at all?
The house has to be clean.
I've heard you'd be surprised how often I've heard that. Yes.
Oh, it drives me fucking crazy. If I'm like right now, my office, like it looks great right here, but like it's chaos. There's shit everywhere, and I'm just like, if my room is sort of like chaotic and crazy. Sorry, my camera's probably shaking a little bit. Why is it not focusing now? Anyway, if it's crazy, I just go, oh my God, I don't want to do that. Like I need to clean this up. I gotta do laundry, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not really a neat freak. I want it. It just got to feel like there's nothing distracting me. So that's an issue. Sorry, I realized my camera just went offline maybe a little bit.
Yeah, you're there.
There. And then the other thing is, the dog's got to be walked because they need to fuck off and leave me alone. And usually they're like, Mom, is it time? Is it time?
Right.
And then, like I no laptops in the room, no computer, no distraction, that stuff I'm so easily distracted. So I just put everything on silent and I'll just spend a few hours. And yeah.
Morning best time, or does that not matter?
No, I actually prefer evening. Like my magic window is like 3 to 7, 3 to 7. That's
really? Okay.
Yeah. That's my magic time.
And computer or pen and paper?
I still use these booklets that someone gave me or that I bought, and they're vinyl, old vinyl records or the cover, and then someone made these like as like a craft project or something. Like this fan gave me a bunch of them, and I've used those for years because there's just tons of blank pages. And I don't know why, but they've like I have like 30 moleskins or whatever they are, and I have a few nice pens, but in the end it's like, holy fuck, where's the pen? Where's the paper? Oh, whoa, whoa.
Yeah, so Mary actually during our interview had a sign that she held up, and her exact quote that she said to me, I'm reading because I've written it down: adjectives suck. Too many adjectives suck. A good song needs movement. Um, and I think the sign said like fewer adjectives, more poetry, or something like that. But she's very adamant about that in a song. So I'm curious, is that, I guess she's very, I guess her whole thing was a song needs she said motion and movement. So yeah, I mean, what do you make of that? Does that ring true at all? Kathleen, go ahead.
Yeah, uh, I I had a guy who played in my band for years, a drummer who played in like Canadian country acts for a long time, and he always did such a good impression of like popular mainstream country songs where they like detail the song would be about a guy like going to work, but like he's even detailed the brand of floss that he uses in the song lyric. You're like, there's too many details. It's too detailed. And that's the stuff that drives me crazy, but it's also fascinating. Like what's with the white t-shirt and blue jeans description? Every song that's on the radio these days, gonna get my white t-shirt and blue jeans. You're like, t-shirt and jeans. It's t-shirt and jeans. Can you just fucking cut it? So I'm with you. I'm with you on the like the adjective, like get the fuck out of my way. Like you don't have to give people room to put themselves in your songs. Like that's always an important, like if you're worried about like, am I telling this right? Is this accurate? You're like, who cares if it's accurate? People want to see themselves in it too. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dave?
And motion, you're right. Motion, like the whole don't bore us, get to the chorus. If you have a good chorus and you have a good idea for that, it's always going to be reward. Like it's always like that's the glue in all the songs. Like you don't have to do a 10-minute setup. Having said that, I like Josh Ritter's songs, and they're 45 minutes each. So, I like everything.
Yeah. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm hesitant. It's like this weird punk rock thing, that kicks in when somebody goes, you can't use adjectives or you can't use adverb. I'm like,
I could do
I
it.
mean, right. So I'm sort of, my wife has a for it. I don't know, it's like a defiant disorder, whatever the hell it is. I don't know,
Yeah.
some therapist term.
Oppositional defiant, right? Isn't that
yes,
it? Oppositional defiant.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. She's like, have you discussed with your therapist my idea that I'm like, no, that's our time. Me and the therapist are in here without you. Anyway, but yeah, she's probably right. I don't know. The country thing is weird, all those descriptors. But then I think what people who are listening to country radio they're excited to hear about the floss because they're like, I use that floss too. So
the floss, I use the floss.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it seems like whenever there's a rule, somebody can come up with a way to break it, and it's usually, Bob Dylan or Conor Oberst or somebody, and you're like, oh, there's a really good instance where that didn't play out. But yeah, she's probably right.
Yeah.
Less adjectives. I mean, adverbs are truly out. That you can't.
You got no ad. Yeah, just get a good verb in there, right? You need a good verb that takes the place of an adverb and a crappy verb. That's what I told my students when I taught writing on the college level. So,
right.
Yeah. Okay. So, last question, Dave. I remember Dave. From the one thing I remember from my interview is that you and I both talked about how the enormous stack of magazines on our bedside was a constant source of angst because we'd look at all of those magazines and they would always pile up and we'd never get to them. And I look back now and I think I'm so much of like a reading on an iPad now that I don't even have magazines piling up next to me anymore, but I guess they're all piling up in my Kindle. But I guess that's a long way of saying, Who are you reading now? Who do you like to read? Your favorite authors, go-tos, things you've read recently that you've liked.
I mean, at this point, it's just whatever I can cull from the New Yorker. And I try to get, I try to read the stuff that is interesting and just get rid of them magazine, because they do pile up still. I haven't learned a thing from our interview. And then I'm reading, trying to get through No Drama Discipline, which is, about
Did your wife
parenting
for your oppositional disorder?
Right. Yes. Right. Exactly. And she's like, there's something. It's funny you say that, because when I'm reading these parenting books, and I mean, it's so embarrassing how many times I key in on something that children do that's true for me, and I'm like, oh man, that's something I never learned. I'm 42 years old.
Kathleen, how about you? How much do you like to read? Is that part of your, how much does that influence your songwriting, stuff like that?
Wow. I think it did early on. I didn't read a lot until I was in my last year of high school, and I was really struggling in school. I was pretty I wanted to be done like years before. I was kind of off doing my own thing, smoking weed. And my principal offered me an independent course, or I looked it up and said I could be doing an independent literary course. And my principal said, okay, I'll be your teacher, be your supervisor for it. And I'm going to pick 5 books or 8 books that you have to read over the course of the year. And we're going to sit down once you've finished reading each of them, and we're going to talk about them. And the book that changed my life was A Prayer for Owen Meany. And I remember the moment that my life changed, where I was reading this book and I was getting into it. I really enjoyed the story. And I found myself reading in public places, laughing out loud during some of the scenes that I was reading. And it just opened my, it was so revelatory to have that experience reading a book. Everything had been, Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness and Kill a Mockingbird. And you're like,
Right.
it's so there. Finally, someone gave me some inspired choices to get me excited about reading, to have a joy for reading rather than an analysis. And so that changed my life a lot. And then, interestingly, so I enjoyed reading a lot of fiction. I enjoyed reading a lot of Canadian fiction. And then when I got clinically depressed, I noticed one of the things that really struggled in my lifestyle was that reading was really challenging. I couldn't stay with a book. I couldn't stay reading. I gave up. I started 1 million books and didn't finish 1 million books. And I ended up finding out that actually is a very common thing with depression. And I'm sure it just speaks to the fact that sometimes I'm not great at staying on task, but I ended up reading a lot of books during my depression, or dabbling in books about things that really helped me kind of recover from my mental illness, and things like something really throwaway, but not throwaway. It's a book that really helped me was a book called The 4 Agreements. And it's just such a simple, it could be like your classic sort of like entry level self-help book, but it really changed my life in my course of getting well, and how I kind of deal with difficult circumstances, interpersonal things going forward. But I've come back to reading quite a bit again, and I visited my brother. I really need to be out of my day-to-day life to consume books. And so when I go on vacation or I travel, I read. And I find the distraction of day-to-day difficult. And I'm usually doing this by 10:30. Like if I pick up a book in the evening, I'm a write-off. Like I'm my mother. I'm my mother now. So, but yeah, I've read a lot of really beautiful books in the last year. And literature is really important to me. I don't read a lot of magazine or short story work. I don't really read poetry, but I love my fiction. Yeah.